we continue to lesson 8B, and this is now getting into the actual plant breeding following pre-breeding. I want to get back to this diagram again because it's really about the entire course. As we'll see, the needs assessment towards desired features in a new cultivar is covered. These other ticks also mean that we've covered these lectures up to this point. And this point, as we mentioned and concluded in lesson 8B, is pre-breeding. And again, it's a long trip right from this side coming way down to this part here, and that can take between 5 to 8 years. That's why in plant breeding, we don't, for example, in pearl millet, to start with the gene bank materials in Windhoek. We can get some varieties of palm millet that have been bred for elsewhere and fashion them or tailor make them to fit Namibia, as long as there are agreements of using the elite materials to actually have a head start on what we want by taking some of the desirable alleles, for example, in those varieties elsewhere, and then putting them in our Okashana too. So again, we are now going to be moving to these areas, and these areas, as it is, I mentioned that let's remember the word gender PM. And as we indicated last time, this breeding program that follows a pre-breeding is employed where plant breeders wish to change the characteristics of the plants to more improved level, to another higher level than that currently in use. So again, remember, we indicated here before that we need to have worked with the breeding goals. So here, this question is very pertinent. As a breeder, do you have a breeding goal? Just to remind us, because really we wouldn't have gotten into this lecture at that point of the introduction to the module. But we, at this point of getting into a breeding program, we need to have developed as a breeder a breeding goal. What's a breeding goal? Is the specification of the traits to be improved. And I have developed what I like to call the breeding goal formulator table, which will assist you in an exercise which I had hoped that we could do if we have time. In the formulator table, the breeding formulator table, we also have an added emphasis given to each trait, and we'll see it shortly. So really, a breeding goal is the road map. It gives the player, the plant breeder, the direction in which he must walk to improve the population to a new cultivar. So really, like in a football field where you have a goal at the other end and you are aiming as a player to get there, can you measure the goal? Because you hope that you want to go and score. Can you measure it? Yes, because what you want to go and put in the goalpost as a score is one. Because if you are a breeder, a player, in principle, one ball is a trait of interest. But of course, it's possible to assume that as a breeder, you can be playing two balls at the same time into the same goal. But successively, as the match goes on, you, together with the other core, the core players will be wanting to drop a ball in the goal. And so you can have a breeding goal to score at least 2 or 3 goals, determining the advantage, the strength of your genetic gain that you'll be making at every rate of heading to that goal. So yes, a breeding goal can be measured. But remember, a breeding goal is not an objective, it's the goal. So really, that's where we should possibly pause for the moment about a breeding goal. But you see, you need to work with this breeding goal into a breeding program. The white part that I did indicate here before, at the bottom here, you need to work, this is a breeding program. You need to walk into it with a breeding goal. So in that program, on the horizontal part of the slide I have shown, does consist of a series of generations by small steps in order to realize the breeding goal traits. Remember the saying, Rome was not built in one day. So if you can remember our gender PM, it will guide you as some of the small steps that are needed to realize the breeding goal traits. Actually, they are not small steps because they require a lot of time, skill, and resources. So here within a breeding program, breeding goal determines which traits are to be, whether qualitative or quantitative, that you want to build, to improve in the new cultivar you are headed to achieve in the long run. So there are conditions to measure the goal. Conditions to measure the goal. If you are playing football, soccer game, or any other one, the coach will tell you, one, you need the speed. Two, you need the tactic. Three, you need the statistical aspect, attitude of the probability of really achieving the goal. Likewise, in plant breeding, breeding goals are directed towards the future and require tenacity, hanging on. The breeding goal has the production aims of the future, just like when you are a player of a ball, the goalpost is the future you are heading toward. And therefore, breeding goals are directed towards the future and require tenacity. The breeding goal also involves the improvement of multiple traits simultaneously, meaning, like we said, a plant breeder does not really play the game alone. That really a plant breeder has an aim to go there and score the first goal, a trait. The core player can be considered as playing another trait in there. And therefore, it involves multiple traits simultaneously. So in practical situations, it is often not a single trait, not a single goal that you are aiming, not a single score that you are aiming for, but a combination of scores, what you enter into the goalpost, a combination of traits, and specified according to their relative importance. In football, for example, you may want to be scoring a certain number so that you can really enter a certain league and move on from Namibian to the all African football game to the world football game. So really, it is according to the relative importance. Just winning at a Namibian level is good enough. If that's all there is importance to it, you don't have to play outside Namibia. Breeding goals should hold for many generations for one to be described as a successful breeding program. This is why, really, that goal is not measurable. If, for example, the material a breeder has or the cultivar a breeder has developed will end up being vulnerable in a short period of time, falling to the incongruencies of the biotic stress or abiotic stress. Then really, that goal cannot hold for many generations. If for every generation you do, you find for every 2 steps you have walked to the rate of genetic gain to a response, to a selection or selection response, you walk 1 step back. Then really the breeding condition for a measurable goal does not hold very well. So we have agreed that from the working accessions in a gene bank, a plant breeder will have identified germplasm of promise, which is in intermediate form. And we have also said that then the plant breeder is then ready to enter the intermediates into a breeding program. We've said that. Remember, we've said that with the pre-breeding where we are in entering a breeding program, we now are equipped with predictive criteria, not with a new variety, with predictive criteria. So now the decisions a breeder makes in her breeding program will in effect influence the future seed industry and the producer aim. Remember, the producer aim, the farmer aim, is really served by the materials or the cultivar that the breeder hands to the producer. So it is presupposed that the breeder has analyzed the market and has an idea as to what consumers will demand some years from now. Some years from now. So in the process, the breeder will be defining and updating her breeding goal or objective, and that's a very important part of the potential success of her breeding program. Remember, the programs, if the breeding aspects have been packaged properly, then they can maximize the rate of increase of some merit function, which could be economic, trade, value, the profit of that trade, that in a way is associated with a genetic basis. So in fact, then here, the genetic basis provided by the estimation of breeding values. Breeding values. Remember what we said breeding values are. Remember? Breeding values, heritability. Because here, the candidates for selection for the highest merit or breeding value are kept as parents in the successive selection from generation to generation. And those with the lowest merit are actually culled, they are put aside, they are eliminated, or they are used less intensively. Because when you're crossing parents, remember, the cardinal rule is crossing good with good, crossing good with good, meaning crossing those candidates with the highest breeding value, highest heritability. All right? So at this point here, there are at least two key questions associated with the breeder's endeavor in a breeding program. How merit or the economic trait value is defined and how it is assessed. Remember, we cannot have variation and we cannot have variance unless really we have a quantitative character that is varying. And so we said that a quantitative character is continuous character. So let's distinguish this issue from goal to objectives. Remember, a goal overacts objectives. In fact, well, let's for the moment just say that. Because a goal really contributes to the actually influences the purpose, the aim. And the aim or the purpose influences or directs the breeding objectives. And the breeding objectives influence or they talk to the activities that must be done. And the activities talk to the cost of the inputs. That's sort of the top-down talking to right up to what is done at the activity level is called the intervention logical framework, but enough on that aspect. So when we now move to the issue of breeding objectives in a breeding programs, they are assumed to have been developed already. Prior to the GDP You remember generative and the other D? The other D? Remember the other D? Do you remember the P? Do you remember the M? The gender? PM? D for derivative, which involves selection. So the breeding objective is conditional on two components. On two components. Because now at this point of the breeding objectives, a breeder is thinking about the final or the producer who is the user of the future variety being developed. So these two components are one, traits that affect profit. I want to remind us here, if I alluded to the issue of genetic gain being a profit, let's forget that. Rate of genetic gain is of interest to a plant breeder. But breeding objective here has the condition that a particular trait of interest must be that will affect the profit to a farmer. And then generally, we have the other condition being the economic values of traits. Trade affecting profit and economic values of trades. So we shall want to look at this very quickly before we get into details of the breeding program, the hands-on bit. So this will be the lesson 8B, and hopefully the next one will be lesson 8C. The economic value of a trade is the change in profit after changing the trade. For example, the trade from T1 to T2. T1 or T2 is really the level, trade level 1 to trade level 2. All right? Trade level 1 to trade level 2. So breeding values are the economic worth of individual genotype, and they are judged by the average performance of the offspring. In other words, BV is a value of an individual judged by the mean value of its progeny. So the BV is about the value of genes to the progeny, not to the genotype. All right. We have reasons of using the EBVs here, as you can see. Many economically important traits cannot be determined by visual appraisal alone. Instead, estimated breeding values can be tracked and measured on heritable traits. All right? So the other aspect that we need to consider here in the breeding objectives is looking at focusing on multi-trait selection, where there is need to combine the relative economic weights and the genetic parameters, that is heritabilities, correlations, and so on and so forth. the index is more efficient than single trade selection. It's a simple method which combines or integrates information from different trades and different relatives, and is essentially a multiple regression predictor of project performance or breeding value of an objective, typically economic merit from a set of observations. All right. So selection index with desired gains now will determine economic values that lead to a response. But rather than doing that, we want to look at a desired response that has economic values implicit. So that it's important to note that economic values are not a determinant of a desired or expected response, but rather that the latter should have economic value. All right. So let's look at what we mean here. We have trades affecting profit, then we have economic values of trades. Those are the conditions of the objective. So if we take the breeding value, as you can see here, we have, for example, objective, which is equal to breeding value 1, breeding value 2, and so on and so forth, and we combine. So we can look at the trades affecting profit with this detail here. Look at it with some passing interest. All right. So the economic values are derived as shown here. 1 unit added, as you can see in the economic value when we are looking at a trade. All right. So let's look at this, for example, Mahangu aggregate genotype breeding instance. We have a simplified multi-selection planner. Let's say for trait 1, we want white grain. All right. We may want high grain seed yield. You see, it's about grain, as you can see. White, high grain. I mean, high grain yield. All right. We have trait 3, good standability. And of course, good standability is related to the retention of a successful white grain, high grain plant stand, right? And then, of course, short stature. Again, shorter. And for those who have been at Mayhem and you saw sorghum, shorter, semi-dwarf with compact brain. And I showed that in the other slide in the previous lessons. And then, of course, trait 5, bristle for biotic seed head with bristles for biotic tolerance. You see, when we're talking about trait 1, trait 2, trait 3, trait 4, trait 5, we can see that these are levels of really a single character with components that are various traits, because these are affected by different alleles. So if you understand that, we can easily begin to look at, when you're looking at the economic value and you are looking at a trait, that if we have a economic value of seed, improved seed, then we could be looking at a change in profit after changing the mean for that trait by 1 unit. For example, if we come to the issue of the white grain, all right? White grain, obviously that's preferred, likely to be preferred by farmers because they'll be planting for consumers who want white flour. But you see, you add the fact that it needs to be high yield so that when a farmer grows maize or palm millet, it will have to produce abundant yield. Yeah. And that is trait 2, another level of the seed character state. And then we are looking at good standability of the stock, because then that way the stock is able to hold more seeds that contribute to high seed yield, but also are of the acceptable yield. So if we look at the botanical organs and we look at the chronological phenologies, we can begin to look at what is the product we want, for where and for when, temporal, yeah, time, which is more or less fitting the issue of chronological as you begin to evaluate that. And then, of course, any other relevant histamine pi that are related to the character of seed that we want. All right, so we will stop at that as lesson 8B at this point, and continue a little later